It was late fall when I decided to embark on a road trip that would take me halfway across the country. The air had that crisp chill to it, and the trees were shedding the last of their golden leaves. I'd been feeling a bit restless lately. Work was getting monotonous and I needed a break. A close friend of mine had invited me out to his place, nestled in the heart of the mountains, for a weekend getaway. It sounded like just the escape I needed. I packed up my car with the essentials, a few changes of clothes, snacks for the road, and a playlist of my favorite music to keep me company. It was a 6-hour drive, but I was looking forward to the solitude. I'd always loved road trips, the freedom of the open road, the way the world seemed to stretch out endlessly in front of me. The first few hours of the drive were uneventful. The highway was mostly empty, save for the occasional truck rumbling past me. I rolled down the windows, letting the cool air wake me up as I cruised along, lost in thought. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over everything, I started to feel that familiar sense of unease that comes with the dark. Something about driving at night has always unnerved me, even though I'd done it countless times before. The world seemed different in the dark, more isolated, more vulnerable. Still, I pressed on, telling myself that it was all in my head. There was no reason to feel anxious. I'd be at my friend's place soon enough, and then I could relax and unwind. Little did I know, the night was just getting started. About 4 hours into my trip, the highway started to change. The once bustling road became eerily quiet, with fewer and fewer cars passing by. I glanced at the GPS. According to the directions, I still had another 2 hours to go, but the road ahead was a long, lonely stretch of asphalt, with no sign of any exits or gas stations in sight. That's when I saw her. She was standing on the side of the road, right near a mile marker. A lone figure, her thumb outstretched, trying to hitch a ride. At first, I couldn't believe my eyes. I mean, who hitchhikes anymore, especially out in the middle of nowhere? But there she was, standing still, her long hair blowing slightly in the evening breeze. As I got closer, I slowed the car, trying to get a better look at her. She looked normal, maybe a little disheveled, but that wasn't unusual for someone who'd been standing on the side of the road for who knows how long. She wore a long, faded dress, and her face had this hollow, tired look to it, like she'd been walking for miles. I'm not usually one to stop for strangers, especially not when I'm traveling alone, but something about her caught my attention. Maybe it was the way she seemed so out of place, or maybe it was the sadness in her eyes. I don't know what made me do it, but before I could second-guess myself, I pulled over. As my car slowed to a stop just ahead of her, I felt my heart race a little. This wasn't something I did, picking up strangers. I'd always heard stories about hitchhikers, and none of them ended well. But something told me this woman wasn't a threat. Maybe she was lost, stranded, or in need of help. I could give her a lift to the next town, and that would be the end of it. I rolled down the passenger side window and leaned over slightly. "Need a ride?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my voice betrayed a hint of nervousness. For a moment she didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at me with those wide, sad eyes. Then, without a word, she nodded and opened the door, slipping into the seat beside me. The door shut with a soft click, and suddenly the air inside the car felt colder. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to strike up a conversation. But she didn't answer right away. Instead, she just stared straight ahead, her hands folded neatly in her lap as if she was deep in thought. "Just up ahead," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not far." I nodded, unsure of what else to say. The road stretched out in front of us, dark and desolate, with no sign of any town or gas station nearby. But I figured she knew where she was going. So I put the car in drive and continued on, the silence between us growing heavier with each passing mile. As we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The woman beside me hadn't said another word since she got into the car, and the atmosphere felt off. I tried to ignore the creeping unease, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. It wasn't just the silence, it was the way she sat so still, her eyes never leaving the road ahead. I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye, trying to get a better look without being too obvious. Her face was pale, almost ghostly in the dim light of the dashboard. Her hair hung limp and unkempt, and her dress, now that I could see it more clearly, looked worn, like it had been through rough times. "Where are you coming from?" I asked, hoping to break the silence and maybe get her to open up. But again, she didn't answer. She just sat there, staring ahead as if I hadn't spoken at all. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. Something about this whole situation was starting to freak me out. I wasn't one to scare easily, but there was something unsettling about the way she carried herself, so calm, so detached. I debated whether I should ask her to get out, but then again, I didn't want to seem rude, especially if she was in trouble. For all I knew, she'd been through something traumatic, and maybe that's why she wasn't talking. Still, the silence was deafening. The minutes dragged on, and the road seemed to stretch endlessly before us. The further we drove, the more isolated I felt. The radio, which had been playing softly in the background, now seemed like white noise, distant and meaningless in the heavy silence. I tried to focus on the road, but every now and then my eyes drifted to the rearview mirror. I wasn't sure why. I just had this strange urge to check behind me. Maybe it was paranoia, or maybe it was the growing tension in the air. And then, in one of those fleeting glances, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Her reflection. The woman's reflection in the rearview mirror was different, distorted. In the dim light of the car's interior, her face looked gaunt, her eyes hollow, and her skin almost translucent. It was as if her reflection didn't quite match the woman sitting next to me. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, but when I looked again, the reflection remained the same, haunting and eerie, like something out of a nightmare. I quickly glanced over at her, my heart pounding in my chest, but she was just sitting there, still and silent, looking exactly as she had before. There was no sign of the twisted, ghastly figure I'd seen in the mirror. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. What was going on? Was I just tired? Had the long hours on the road finally gotten to me? Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had picked up something far more sinister than a hitchhiker. As the miles passed, the air in the car grew colder. It wasn't just the chill of the night air seeping through the windows. It was something else, something unnatural. The temperature seemed to drop with each passing minute, and I found myself shivering, even though I hadn't felt cold before. I glanced at the woman again, hoping to find some sort of explanation in her expression. But she remained as she was, silent, still, and unnervingly calm. It was as if she didn't notice the cold, or maybe she didn't care. The fear in me grew, gnawing at my insides. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. I had picked her up in the middle of nowhere, and now I was stuck with her. I didn't know who she was, where she was going, or what she wanted. All I knew was that something was very, very wrong. I thought about pulling over, telling her I couldn't go any further. Maybe I could drop her off at the next exit, even if there wasn't anything there. But as soon as that thought crossed my mind, something inside me froze. I couldn't bring myself to stop. It was as if an invisible force was pushing me forward, keeping me on the road. The road stretched on like a black ribbon in the night, the headlights of my car cutting through the thick darkness. My fingers clenched the steering wheel tightly, the knuckles white as I tried to calm the rising panic in my chest. My mind was racing with possibilities, but none of them made sense. I was alone with this strange woman, and every instinct was telling me to get away from her as fast as I could. But I didn't. I couldn't. It was as if something was holding me back, something that wasn't entirely my own fear. I glanced at the woman again, and for a brief moment I saw her lips twitch, almost as if she were about to smile, but the expression never fully formed. The silence inside the car felt oppressive. I wanted to break it, to say something, anything, just to feel like I was in control again. But the words wouldn't come. My throat was tight and my thoughts were jumbled. I kept driving, my eyes fixed on the road ahead, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something out there in the darkness, watching us, waiting. The air was thick with a tension I couldn't explain. It wasn't just fear. It was something more, something darker. After what felt like hours of driving, the GPS chirped to life, the robotic voice instructing me to take the next exit. I glanced at the screen, relieved to see that we were approaching some sort of turnoff. But when I looked up at the road ahead, there was nothing there. No exit sign, no off-ramp, just the same empty stretch of highway I'd been driving on for miles. I frowned and slowed the car, confused. "There's no exit here," I muttered, more to myself than to the woman beside me. But she responded, her voice low and distant. "It's just up ahead." I glanced at her, surprised that she had spoken. Her tone was strange, almost as if she knew something I didn't. My heart pounded harder in my chest, but I kept driving, my eyes scanning the road for any sign of the exit. And then, out of nowhere it appeared. A narrow, winding road branched off from the highway, barely visible in the dim light of my headlights. There was no sign marking it, no indication that it led anywhere. It was just there. "I don't think I should take this road," I said more firmly this time, my voice shaking slightly. But the woman turned to me, her eyes locking onto mine for the first time since she'd gotten into the car. Her gaze was intense, her eyes dark and unreadable. "This is the way." A cold shiver ran down my spine. I hesitated for a moment, my instincts screaming at me to keep driving, to stay on the highway. But there was something about the way she looked at me, something that made it impossible for me to say no. I turned onto the road. The road was narrow and winding, surrounded by tall, looming trees that seemed to press in from both sides. My headlights barely pierced the thick darkness, and the further I drove, the more isolated I felt. It was as if the world outside the car had disappeared, swallowed up by the blackness. I kept glancing at the woman beside me, but she was staring straight ahead, her face expressionless. I wanted to ask her where we were going, but something told me I wouldn't get an answer. The unease in my gut grew stronger with each passing minute, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my hands ached. The road twisted and turned, each bend more disorienting than the last. It felt like we were going deeper and deeper into some unknown place, far from any civilization. My GPS had gone silent, and when I glanced at the screen, I saw that the map was blank. No roads, no landmarks, just an empty space. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "How much further?" I asked, my voice shaky. She didn't answer. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. I was trapped, driving deeper into the night with no idea where I was headed and no way to turn back. As we continued down the winding road, I started to notice something strange in the trees. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, shadows playing tricks on my eyes. But the more I looked, the more certain I became. There were figures moving in the darkness. They were hard to make out, just fleeting shapes that seemed to dart between the trees, barely visible in the dim light of my headlights. But they were there, watching. My heart raced, and I glanced at the woman again, hoping she had noticed too. But she remained still, her gaze fixed on the road ahead, as if nothing was wrong. I swallowed hard, my palms sweating against the steering wheel. "Do you see that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She didn't respond. I wasn't sure if she had even heard me. The shapes in the trees grew more distinct, moving closer to the road. I couldn't make out any details, just dark, shadowy figures that seemed to blend into the night. But there was something unnatural about the way they moved, something that sent a chill down my spine. I pressed down on the gas, eager to put some distance between us and whatever was lurking in the woods. The car sped up, the engine humming louder, but the road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures vanished. I breathed a sigh of relief, my heart still pounding in my chest. Whatever I had seen, or thought I had seen, was gone now. The trees were still, the shadows no longer moving. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was all in my head. The long drive, the darkness, the silence, it was enough to make anyone paranoid. But then I glanced at the passenger seat. The woman was gone. My heart skipped a beat, and I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt in the middle of the road. I whipped my head around, searching the back seat, the side of the road, anywhere she could have gone, but there was no sign of her. I sat there, frozen, my mind racing. How could she have just disappeared? I hadn't stopped the car, and there was no way she could have gotten out without me noticing. I looked back at the seat where she had been sitting, and that's when I saw it. A faint impression in the fabric, like someone had been sitting there moments ago. But there was no trace of her, no sign that she had ever been there at all. Panic surged through me as I sat there in the middle of the road, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I couldn't make sense of what had just happened. One moment she had been sitting beside me, and the next, she was gone, vanished without a trace. I looked around frantically, half expecting to see her standing on the side of the road, or maybe lurking in the shadows of the trees. But there was nothing. Just the empty road stretching out in front of me, and the thick, oppressive darkness all around. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to think rationally. Maybe she had gotten out when I wasn't looking. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something strange had happened. Something I couldn't explain. I had to get out of there. I slammed my foot on the gas and sped down the road, the tires screeching against the pavement. I didn't care where the road led anymore. I just needed to get as far away from that place as possible. As I drove, the road seemed to stretch on forever, winding through the trees like a never-ending labyrinth. My GPS was still blank, offering no guidance, and the further I went, the more disoriented I became. It was as if the road itself was leading me deeper into some unknown place, a place where reality didn't quite apply. I checked the rearview mirror constantly, half expecting to see the woman sitting there again, her ghostly reflection staring back at me. But the seat remained empty, and the chill in the air persisted. I tried to calm my racing thoughts, telling myself that I just needed to find the main road. Once I was back on familiar ground, everything would make sense again. But no matter how far I drove, the landscape never changed. The trees loomed on either side of the road, their branches stretching out like skeletal hands. I was trapped. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the road ahead began to widen. A glimmer of hope sparked in my chest as I saw lights in the distance. Small, dim lights, but lights nonetheless. It looked like a gas station or maybe a rest stop. I sped toward it, desperate for any sign of civilization. As I got closer, the building came into view, a small, run-down gas station, the kind you'd only find in the middle of nowhere. The lights flickered faintly, casting eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. I pulled into the parking lot and parked the car, my hands still shaking. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the gas station in disbelief. It felt surreal, like I had crossed over into some otherworldly place. But I had to go inside. I had to know if I was truly alone. I stepped out of the car, the cold night air hitting me like a wall. I walked toward the gas station, my footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. The place looked abandoned, but the lights were still on. I pushed open the door, the bell above it jingling faintly. Inside, the gas station was dimly lit, the shelves covered in dust. There was no one behind the counter, and the place had the distinct smell of something old and forgotten. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. There was no answer. I walked further into the store, my eyes scanning the empty aisles. Everything felt wrong, like I had stepped into a place that time had forgotten. Asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 16. The Haunting Silence, asterisk, asterisk. The silence inside the gas station was deafening. The faint hum of the fluorescent lights flickered, casting long shadows across the floor. I walked slowly, my footsteps soft on the worn-out linoleum, trying not to disturb the heavy stillness that hung in the air. The place seemed frozen in time, abandoned by everyone except me. I reached the counter and tapped the bell, hoping to get someone's attention. The sound echoed through the empty building, but no one appeared. No attendant, no sign of life. Just the empty shelves, the faint buzz of electricity, and the cold creeping into my bones. I turned to leave when something caught my eye. Movement in the reflection of the glass door behind me. My heart leaped into my throat as I whipped around, expecting to see someone standing outside. But there was nothing. Just the empty parking lot, my car sitting there under the dim lights. I blinked, trying to shake the eerie feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I quickly walked out of the store, not wanting to stay in that unsettling place any longer than I had to. As I walked back to my car, I noticed something strange. In the dim light of the parking lot, there was another figure standing near the corner of the building. At first, I thought it was a shadow cast by the flickering lights, but as I approached, I realized it was a person, a man, standing there with his back turned to me. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The man didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. He just stood there, perfectly still. I called out, "Hey, are you okay?" No response. The air around me felt heavy, thick with an unease I couldn't shake. My instincts screamed at me to get in the car and leave, but something about the man's stillness drew me closer. Against my better judgment, I took a few steps toward him, keeping my distance but trying to see his face. But when I rounded the corner, the man was gone. I stood there, staring at the spot where the man had been standing just moments ago, my mind racing. How could he have disappeared so quickly? There was no way he could have just walked away without me seeing him. The parking lot was completely empty, and there was no sign of anyone nearby. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt a growing sense of dread in the pit of my stomach. Something wasn't right. I turned back toward my car, walking quickly now, my footsteps echoing loudly in the silent night. As I reached for the car door, I froze. There, on the passenger seat where the strange woman had been sitting earlier, was a small piece of paper. It hadn't been there before. I knew that for sure. My hand trembled as I picked it up, my heart racing. Scrawled across the paper in messy handwriting were 3 words: "You're not alone." My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The note felt cold in my hand, like it had been left there by something or someone who wasn't entirely human. I quickly looked around, scanning the empty parking lot, but there was no one in sight. No movement, no sounds. Just the distant hum of the gas station lights flickering above me. I threw the note onto the passenger seat, jumped into the car and slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. My breath was coming in ragged gasps as I fumbled to start the engine. Every second I spent sitting there felt like an eternity. Finally, the engine roared to life and I peeled out of the gas station parking lot, tires screeching against the cracked pavement. As I drove, my mind raced. I didn't know who had left the note or what it meant, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that something was still out there watching me, and that no matter how far I drove, I couldn't escape it. The narrow, twisting road stretched endlessly before me, the darkness closing in on all sides. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white as I sped down the highway. My only thought was to get as far away from that gas station and the strange encounters I had experienced as fast as possible. But the further I drove, the more disoriented I became. The road seemed to loop back on itself, winding through the same stretch of trees over and over again. The GPS was still blank, offering no guidance, and my phone had lost signal miles ago. Panic started to set in as I realized that I might be lost. The same eerie feeling that had crept over me earlier returned, stronger now, making the air in the car feel thick and suffocating. I glanced at the rearview mirror again, half expecting to see the woman, or the man, sitting in the back seat. But the seat was empty. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The road ahead seemed to blur, the headlights of my car barely cutting through the thick darkness. I had to get out of this place. I had to find my way back. But the more I drove, the less certain I became that I ever would. I was driving too fast, my foot pressed hard against the gas pedal. My mind was racing, my thoughts jumbled and frantic. I knew I was lost, but I couldn't stop. Something was pushing me forward, keeping me on the road even though I didn't know where it led. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move in the passenger seat. My breath caught in my throat as I turned my head slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. But when I looked, the seat was empty, just like it had been moments ago. I blinked, trying to steady myself. It was just my imagination, I told myself. I was tired, stressed, and scared. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something was very wrong. And then I felt it. A faint, cold pressure on my shoulder like the touch of a hand. I swerved, my heart pounding in my chest, nearly losing control of the car. The road blurred before me and I had to fight to keep the vehicle steady. But when I glanced at the passenger seat again, there was nothing there. Just the cold, empty seat. I was driving in circles. No matter how far I went, the road never seemed to end. It twisted and turned, leading me through the same stretches of dense forest, the same empty fields. The gas station had long since vanished behind me, but the feeling of dread only grew stronger the further I drove. My phone was still dead and the GPS on the dashboard was completely blank. I had no way of knowing where I was, no way of calling for help. All I could do was keep driving, hoping that eventually I'd find a way out. But deep down, I wasn't sure I ever would. It was one of those long, exhausting road trips that seemed never-ending. I had been driving for hours, my body aching, eyes heavy with fatigue. The sun had long since set, leaving the road bathed in a deep, inky blackness, only illuminated by the faint glow of my headlights. I was in the middle of nowhere, driving through desolate back roads that stretched on for miles without a single sign of life. I needed to stop. My eyelids felt like lead, and my hands had started to cramp from gripping the steering wheel too tightly. When I spotted the flickering neon sign up ahead, my heart lifted. It wasn't much, just the faint glow of a rundown motel on the side of the road. But in that moment, it looked like a beacon of hope. I pulled off the highway, gravel crunching under the tires as I turned into the small parking lot. The sign buzzed loudly, the letters half burnt out. Vacancy, it read in flickering red letters. The place looked abandoned, the parking lot empty except for my car. I stepped out, the cold night air biting at my skin. The motel was a single-story building, its paint peeling and windows dark. It didn't look welcoming, but I didn't care. I just needed a place to rest for the night. I grabbed my bag from the car and headed toward the office. The motel office was just as run down as the outside. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and a small bell jingled above me. The smell of dust and mildew filled the air, and the dim light overhead flickered every few seconds. The place looked deserted, but as I approached the counter, I noticed a man sitting behind it, his face obscured by shadows. He was an older man with deep-set eyes and a wrinkled face that looked like it had seen better days. He wore a worn-out plaid shirt, and his fingers drummed absently on the counter as he watched me approach. "Need a room?" he asked, his voice rough and gravelly, like he hadn't spoken to anyone in years. "Yeah," I replied, setting my bag down beside me. "Just for the night." He nodded slowly, as if processing my request took extra effort. Without a word, he reached under the counter and pulled out an old-fashioned key attached to a faded plastic tag. He slid it across the counter toward me, his fingers brushing mine for a brief moment. "Room 12, he muttered, barely looking at me. "End of the hall." I thanked him and quickly grabbed the key, eager to get out of the musty office and into my room. As I walked down the narrow corridor toward room 12, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. The place felt off, like it hadn't been used in years, and I was the first person to set foot inside in a long time. Room 12 was at the far end of the hallway, the last door before a dead end. The carpet beneath my feet was worn and frayed, and the walls were covered in faded, peeling wallpaper that must have been decades old. I inserted the key into the lock, and with a heavy click, the door swung open. The room inside was as bleak as I had expected. The furniture was outdated, the bedspread a faded floral pattern that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. A single lamp sat on the bedside table, casting a dim glow over the room. The air was stale and the faint smell of something rotten lingered in the corners. I shut the door behind me and locked it, suddenly feeling very isolated. I dropped my bag onto the bed and sat down, the springs creaking beneath my weight. The room was silent, save for the distant hum of the neon sign outside. As tired as I was, something about the place made me uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that there were eyes on me even though I was alone. I glanced at the window, the curtains half drawn, and quickly stood to pull them shut completely. The last thing I needed was to see someone, or something, peering in from the darkness outside. Despite my exhaustion, I found it hard to relax. I lay on the bed, staring up at the cracked ceiling, my mind racing. The events of the day replayed in my head, but every now and then my thoughts would drift to the strange feeling I had when I first walked into the motel. Something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I grabbed my phone to check for messages, hoping the distraction would calm my nerves, but there was no signal, not even a single bar. It wasn't surprising considering how remote the area was, but it added to the sense of isolation that had been gnawing at me since I arrived. After what felt like hours of tossing and turning, I finally closed my eyes, hoping to get some rest. But just as I began to drift off, a sound jolted me awake. It was faint at first, a soft rustling noise, like the sound of something moving outside my door. I sat up, listening closely, my heart pounding in my chest. The noise grew louder, like footsteps shuffling down the hallway. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that someone, or something, was just outside my door. I sat frozen on the bed, listening as the footsteps stopped directly in front of my room. My eyes darted to the door, half expecting to see the knob turn or hear a knock. But there was nothing, just the silence pressing in from all sides. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with fear. Who could be out there? Was it the old man from the office, or someone else? Just as I was about to stand up and check, a low, whispering sound came from the other side of the door. It was faint, almost too quiet to hear, but I caught the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, muttering in a language I couldn't understand. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I stood up, slowly approaching the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the knob. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. But all I was met with was the eerie silence. I pressed my ear against the door, listening for any signs of movement, but there was nothing. Whoever or whatever had been outside my door was gone. The rest of the night was a blur of restless tossing and turning. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind outside made my nerves jangle. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong in this place, something beyond just the creepy old motel and its run-down rooms. When the first light of dawn finally crept through the curtains, I jumped out of bed, eager to get out of the motel as quickly as possible. I gathered my things, threw them into my bag, and practically ran out of the room. As I made my way back toward the office to return the key, I noticed how still the place was. The same eerie silence hung in the air, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I walked into the office and the old man was there just as he had been the night before. He barely looked up as I approached the counter to drop off the key. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice rough and detached. I hesitated, unsure whether to mention the strange events of the night before, but something about his tone told me it wouldn't matter. He already knew. "You heard them, didn't you?" he asked, his eyes finally meeting mine. A chill ran down my spine. "Heard who?" The old man leaned forward, lowering his voice. "The others, the ones who never left." I stared at the old man, trying to make sense of his words. His eyes were clouded, but there was something in them, something that told me he wasn't just talking nonsense. He looked at me like he knew exactly what had happened the night before. "This place," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's been here a long time, longer than you or I can remember. And there are things here, things that never move on." I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. "What do you mean?" He sighed, his fingers tapping absently on the counter. "People pass through here just like you. They stay a night, maybe two, but some of them, they never leave. They get stuck here in this place. You were lucky. You're one of the few who made it through the night." I felt my heart skip a beat. Made it through the night?" He nodded solemnly. "Whatever you heard last night, it wasn't your imagination. They're real, and they're always looking for someone new to join them." I didn't stick around to hear more. I couldn't. The old man's words sent a bolt of fear through me, and all I wanted was to get away from that motel as fast as possible. I hurried out of the office, my heart pounding in my chest as I threw my bag into the car and started the engine. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me. But there was nothing, just the motel, growing smaller in the distance. The road stretched out before me, empty and silent, and I pressed the gas pedal harder, eager to put as much distance between myself and that cursed place as possible. But even as the miles rolled by, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had escaped something terrible, something that could have easily taken me if I hadn't left when I did. As I sped down the highway trying to distance myself from the motel, the tension in my body gradually began to ease. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't escape the eerie feeling that clung to me like a shadow. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I expected to see something, or someone, sitting in the back seat. My mind was racing with the old man's words, the whispered warnings, and the strange sounds from the night before. Was it all in my head? Had the exhaustion from the road trip made me imagine things? Or was there something truly sinister lurking in that rundown motel? Deep down, I knew the answer. It wasn't just my imagination. That place was haunted by something beyond comprehension. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. No matter how far I drove, the memory of that night stayed with me. The unsettling silence, the whispered voices, the old man's cryptic words, it all haunted me, refusing to let go. Hours passed and the empty road stretched endlessly ahead of me. It was supposed to be a peaceful drive through the countryside, but after what I'd experienced, every tree, every shadow seemed menacing. My mind was still foggy from lack of sleep, and I couldn't stop thinking about the people the old man had mentioned, the ones who never left. I was jolted from my thoughts when I saw something up ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart leaping into my throat. My car screeched to a halt, the tires kicking up dust. For a split second, I thought I had hit them, but when I looked closer, the figure was gone. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, wondering if I was hallucinating. Maybe I was still shaken up from the motel, my mind playing tricks on me. But when I glanced back, I saw them, standing at the edge of the road, just out of the reach of my headlights. A pale figure watching me. I didn't stick around to find out who or what it was. I floored the gas pedal and took off, my pulse racing. Whatever that was, I wanted no part of it. The haunted feeling that had followed me from the motel had somehow intensified. As the night dragged on, I realized I couldn't keep driving forever. I needed to stop somewhere safe, get some rest, and clear my head. After hours of driving through empty roads, I spotted a small town up ahead, its lights twinkling in the distance. Relief washed over me. Maybe here I could finally relax and put the events of the night behind me. The town was small and quiet, nestled in a valley surrounded by thick forests. The streets were deserted as I pulled into a diner parking lot. I checked the time. It was just past midnight. The neon sign above the diner flickered, much like the motel sign had, but the place seemed clean and welcoming. I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs as I took a deep breath of the crisp night air. The town was eerily quiet, but after what I'd been through, the stillness was almost comforting. I headed inside the diner, hoping to grab a cup of coffee and maybe some food before finding a place to sleep. As I pushed open the door, the bell above it jingled, and I was greeted by a woman behind the counter, smiling warmly at me. For the first time all night, I felt a sense of normalcy return. The woman behind the counter introduced herself as Ellen, her voice soft but friendly. The diner was empty except for me, which was odd for a place that was still open this late. I took a seat at the counter and ordered a coffee, trying to shake off the lingering unease from the road. As Ellen poured the coffee, I couldn't help but notice how clean and well-kept the diner was, a stark contrast to the rundown motel from earlier. Everything seemed in place, almost too perfect, like a set in an old movie. "Long night?" Ellen asked, setting the cup in front of me. "Yeah, you could say that," I replied, taking a sip of the coffee. It was strong, the kind that jolts you awake. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked, leaning against the counter. I shook my head. "Just passing through. Had a weird experience at a motel a few towns back." Ellen's smile faltered for a moment, her eyes darkening. "Oh? Which one?" I hesitated, unsure if I should mention it. "I'm not sure what it was called. Just a small place off the highway." She exchanged a glance with the cook in the back, her expression unreadable. "You might want to be careful around these parts," she said softly. "Not all places are as they seem." Her words sent a chill down my spine. Something about the way she said it reminded me of the old man at the motel. It was as if everyone in this area knew something they weren't telling me. After finishing my coffee, I asked Ellen if there was a place I could stay for the night. She directed me to a small bed and breakfast down the road, assuring me it was much more comfortable than the motels nearby. I thanked her and left the diner, the night air colder than before. As I drove through the empty streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the town. The houses were dark, and there were no cars parked along the curbs. It was as if the town had been frozen in time, waiting for something to happen. When I arrived at the bed and breakfast, the lights were on, and the place looked welcoming. I checked in with the owner, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, and she showed me to my room. The bed was soft, and the room smelled of fresh linens. It was a stark contrast to the motel, and for the first time in hours I felt a sense of calm wash over me. As I lay in bed, the events of the night played over in my head. The strange figure on the road, the whispered voices at the motel, Ellen's cryptic warning. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite put together. But for now, I was safe. At least I hoped I was. I must have fallen asleep almost instantly, my body finally giving in to exhaustion. But I didn't stay asleep for long. At some point during the night, I was jolted awake by a loud knock on the door. I sat up, disoriented, my heart racing. The room was pitch dark, the only sound the soft ticking of a clock on the wall. I waited, listening for another knock, but the silence stretched on. I lay back down, thinking maybe I had imagined it. But then, there it was again. A slow, deliberate knock on the door. I sat up again, my pulse pounding in my ears. I glanced at the clock. 3:12 a.m. Who would be knocking at this hour? I hesitated, not wanting to open the door, but curiosity got the best of me. I swung my legs out of bed and padded toward the door, my hand hovering over the knob. The knocking had stopped, but the unease in the pit of my stomach told me something wasn't right. I opened the door just a crack, peeking out into the hallway, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, bathed in the soft glow of the nightlight plugged into the wall. I stood there, heart pounding, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the only sound was the quiet ticking of the clock in my room. I closed the door, locking it behind me, and returned to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. My mind was racing, and the eerie events of the night weighed heavily on me. I had barely drifted off again when I heard it, another knock. This time it was louder, more insistent. I jumped out of bed, rushing to the door. But again, when I opened it, the hallway was empty. A chill crept down my spine. Something was wrong, very wrong. My road trip had been going smoothly until I took a wrong turn in a sleepy little town somewhere in the Midwest. The detour was supposed to be a quick shortcut, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, I realized I was completely lost. My phone had died hours ago, and the map I had was outdated. I needed to find a place to stay, but it seemed like every motel I passed was either closed or abandoned. As darkness enveloped the landscape, my hope of finding a cozy little inn faded. Just as I was about to give up and sleep in my car, I spotted a van parked on the side of the road, with a small handwritten sign that read, "Lodging available." It seemed sketchy, but at that moment I was desperate. I pulled over and got out of my car, the cold night air biting at my skin. The van was old, its paint chipped and faded, but the lights inside were on. A man in his mid-40s with a scruffy beard and a tired look on his face greeted me as I approached. He wore a worn-out leather jacket and a stained baseball cap. "Need a place to stay?" he asked, his voice rough. I nodded, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that settled in my stomach. "Yeah, I'm looking for a place for the night." The man gestured for me to follow him. "Come on in, I'll get you sorted." The inside of the van was surprisingly well kept, with makeshift beds arranged along the sides and a small, cluttered desk at the back. The man introduced himself as Dave and began rummaging through a pile of papers on the desk. He pulled out a ledger and scribbled down some details before handing me a key. "Room 5, he said, pointing to a small door at the back of the van. "It's the last one. Might be a bit cramped, but it'll do for the night." I thanked him and took the key, my curiosity piqued by the van's peculiar setup. As I walked to my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The van had an oddly isolated atmosphere, and the other rooms seemed strangely quiet. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room was small, with just enough space for a narrow bed and a tiny window. The walls were lined with old, faded wallpaper, and the air was musty. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I tried to settle in for the night, but sleep came hard. The van creaked and groaned as it moved slightly, and every sound seemed amplified in the confined space. I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of the van's engine and the occasional rustling noise coming from the other rooms. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud bang. My heart raced as I sat up, listening intently. The noise had come from somewhere outside, followed by what sounded like muffled voices. I got up and peeked through the small window, but all I could see was the darkness of the night. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination running wild, but the uneasy feeling in my gut persisted. I lay back down, but sleep was elusive. The voices outside continued, growing fainter as if someone was moving away from the van. The next morning, I woke up groggy and tired. The sunlight filtering through the small window did little to improve my mood. I needed to get back on the road, but as I got dressed, I couldn't shake the odd feeling that had plagued me since I arrived. I decided to investigate the van a little further. I quietly walked down the narrow hallway, passing the other rooms. They were all closed, and the air inside was eerily still. When I reached the front of the van, Dave was nowhere to be seen. I looked around, trying to figure out where he might have gone. On a whim, I decided to check out the back of the van. As I approached the rear, I noticed a small door partially open, revealing a room filled with old equipment and supplies. Among the clutter, I found something that made my blood run cold. Several empty containers labeled with a symbol I didn't recognize. The containers looked like they were used for something far more sinister than just cleaning supplies. I quickly shut the door and stepped back, my heart pounding. I had a growing sense that this van was not what it seemed. I needed to get out of there, but I had to find Dave first. I searched the van for Dave, calling out for him, but he was nowhere to be found. I checked the front office area, but it was empty. It felt like I was the only one there. The feeling of isolation grew stronger and panic began to set in. Just as I was about to leave, Dave reappeared, looking as disheveled as ever. "Sorry about that," he said, his voice lacking its earlier gruffness. "Had to take care of some things. You're heading out?" I nodded, trying to hide my unease. "Yeah, I think I've had enough of this place. Thanks for the room." Dave didn't say much as he handed me back my deposit. I quickly left the van, not looking back as I got into my car and drove away. The road stretched out before me, and I was eager to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. As I walked, I noticed the same shadowy figure from the rest stop lurking near the edge of the property. The figure seemed to be following me, keeping a safe distance but never quite out of sight. I quickened my pace, trying to get back to my room, but the figure continued to trail me. I felt a surge of panic as I reached my room and fumbled with the key. Once inside, I locked the door and peered through the window, but the figure was gone. I was exhausted and on edge, but I knew I couldn't stay in that motel forever. The sense of paranoia and fear was overwhelming, and I was determined to find out more about the mysterious van and the strange occurrences. The next morning, I decided to do some research. I went to a local library and scoured through old newspapers and public records, hoping to find any information about the van or Dave. It took hours of searching, but eventually, I stumbled upon a small article about a similar van that had been involved in several disappearances over the years. The article described a pattern of people vanishing after staying in a van operated by a man named Dave. The van was rumored to be a front for something much more sinister. The article mentioned that the van was often seen in remote areas and that the people who disappeared were never found. I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I read through the details. It seemed like the van I had stayed in was part of a larger, horrifying pattern. I needed to act quickly, but I had no idea where Dave might be or how to find him. With the new information in hand, I decided to leave town and continue my journey. I was determined to put as much distance between myself and the van as possible, but as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw the same shadowy figure from the motel, but it was always just out of sight. The paranoia was taking a toll on me, and I struggled to focus on the road. I made a stop at a gas station, hoping to refuel both my car and my sense of security. As I filled up the tank, I noticed a familiar-looking van parked at the far end of the lot. My heart skipped a beat. It was unmistakably the same van I had stayed in. I quickly paid for the gas and got back into my car, trying to remain calm. The van was parked far away, and there was no sign of Dave or anyone else nearby, but the sight of the van made my blood run cold. As I drove away, I kept a close eye on my surroundings, my senses heightened. I drove for hours, taking every precaution to avoid being followed. I avoided main roads and took back routes, hoping to lose any potential tail. But as night fell, I found myself in a remote area with no signs of civilization. My anxiety was mounting, and I decided to pull over and check my surroundings. I parked in a secluded spot and got out, scanning the area for any signs of danger. While I was outside, I heard the distant rumble of an engine. My heart sank as I turned around and saw the same unmarked van approaching. It was moving slowly, as if searching for something or someone. I quickly jumped back into my car, locking the doors and trying to stay hidden. The van passed by slowly, its headlights casting eerie shadows on the trees. I held my breath, hoping that the van would continue on its way. But to my horror, the van stopped not far from where I was parked. I could see the figure of a man getting out and walking towards the woods. My fear turned to panic, and I knew I had to act fast. As the van remained stationary, I decided to drive away, hoping to find safety elsewhere. I drove for miles, my nerves frayed and my mind racing. Just when I thought I was in the clear, I saw a car's headlights approaching from behind. I pulled over, my heart racing, and the car stopped beside me. To my surprise, a woman stepped out looking concerned. She introduced herself as Sarah and explained that she had seen me earlier and was worried when she saw the van following me. Sarah offered to help and suggested we go to the nearest town for assistance. I was grateful for her help and followed her as we drove towards the town. Sarah's presence was a small comfort in an otherwise terrifying situation. When we arrived in the town, Sarah took me to a local diner where we could discuss what had happened. The diner was bustling with activity, and I finally felt a sense of normalcy. As I recounted the events of the past few days, Sarah listened intently, her expression growing more concerned with each detail. She revealed that she had heard rumors about the van and the people who disappeared, but she hadn't believed them until now. Sarah suggested that we contact the local authorities to report the van and the strange occurrences. We headed to the police station, hoping that they could provide some answers and protect us from whatever was happening. At the police station, I explained everything to the officers, providing them with all the information I had gathered. They took the report seriously and promised to investigate the van and its connection to the disappearances. Sarah and I waited anxiously for any updates. The town's atmosphere was oddly quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The officers assured us they would do everything they could to find out more about the van and its occupants. While we waited, Sarah and I took some time to gather our thoughts and try to regain our composure. The situation had been overwhelming, and we needed to stay focused if we wanted to find answers. By morning, the police had conducted a search of the area where I had last seen the van, but there was no sign of it. The officers informed us that the van had disappeared without a trace, and there were no leads on its whereabouts. I was frustrated and scared, feeling like we were no closer to understanding what was happening. Sarah and I decided to stay in town for a while longer, hoping that the police would find something new or that the van would reappear. In the meantime, we tried to piece together any additional information that might help. We spoke to locals and researched any connections to the van and its mysterious occupants, but we found little concrete evidence. As days passed, the feeling of dread never left me. The town seemed to be hiding something, and I couldn't shake the impression that the van's disappearance was part of a larger, more sinister plan. Sarah and I decided to visit some of the local landmarks and historical sites, hoping to gain insight into the town's history. We found nothing out of the ordinary, but the sense of unease remained. One evening, as we walked through a park near the edge of town, we saw a group of people gathered around a bonfire. They were talking in hushed tones, and their expressions were somber. It felt like they were discussing something important, something we were not meant to know. We approached the group cautiously, but as soon as they noticed us, they fell silent. Their gaze was cold and unfriendly, and we decided to leave before things escalated. Determined to get answers, Sarah and I continued our investigation, even as the town's atmosphere grew more oppressive. We scoured old records and talked to anyone who might have information about the van and its mysterious driver. One day, we came across an old newspaper article that mentioned a series of strange events in the town's past. The article described similar disappearances and unmarked vehicles, but the details were vague and inconclusive. We also discovered a local legend about a secret organization that was rumored to operate in the shadows, manipulating events and people for their own purposes. The legend seemed far-fetched, but it matched the eerie feeling that had followed us since we arrived. One night, as Sarah and I were walking back to our motel, we were approached by a man who introduced himself as Jake. He claimed to be a private investigator who had been looking into the same case. Jake revealed that he had been tracking the unmarked van for years, uncovering a network of disappearances and strange occurrences. He had been investigating the town and its connections to the van, but his efforts had been thwarted by powerful individuals who wanted to keep the truth hidden. Jake offered to join forces with us and promised to share any information he had. We agreed, feeling that our chances of finding answers had improved with his help. With Jake's assistance, our investigation took on a new level of intensity. We delved into the town's history and uncovered more clues about the van and its connection to the disappearances. Jake revealed that the van was part of a larger operation involving illegal activities and human trafficking. The unmarked van was used to transport victims to hidden locations, where they were exploited or vanished without a trace. Our findings were chilling, and we knew we had to act quickly. We coordinated with the police and other authorities, sharing our information and trying to build a case against those responsible. As the investigation progressed, we managed to locate the van's last known location, a remote warehouse on the outskirts of town. We gathered a group of investigators and law enforcement officers and planned a raid on the warehouse. When we arrived, the scene was tense. We moved in cautiously, searching the building for evidence and any remaining occupants. The warehouse was eerily quiet, and we found several empty containers similar to the ones I had seen in the van. In a hidden room, we discovered a group of individuals who had been held captive. They were weak and disoriented, but grateful for the rescue. The authorities took them into custody, and we finally felt a sense of accomplishment. The raid on the warehouse revealed the extent of the illegal activities and led to multiple arrests. The authorities continued their investigation, uncovering more details about the network responsible for the disappearances. Sarah, Jake, and I were hailed as heroes for our role in exposing the operation. The town began to recover from the unsettling events, and the once hidden secrets were brought to light. As for me, the experience had left its mark. I had faced fear and uncertainty, but I had also learned the importance of seeking the truth and standing up against injustice. I resumed my journey, carrying the lessons I had learned with me and hoping for a future where such darkness could be faced and overcome. The road trip that had begun as a simple adventure had turned into a harrowing journey of discovery and survival. The unmarked van had been a symbol of hidden danger and fear, but it had also led to a greater understanding of the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected places. As I continued on my travels, I couldn't help but reflect on the events that had transpired. The memory of the van and its occupants would always be with me, a reminder of the importance of vigilance and the strength found in the pursuit of truth. I hoped that by sharing my story, others would be encouraged to seek out the truth, stand up against fear, and face the unknown with courage and determination.